to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Jacobs. I am the Director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Before we begin, I want to invite you to become part of today's conversation. You'll see at the bottom there's a Q&A button. That's your opportunity to give us great questions. It's an important part of today's conversation, and we encourage you to do that. Also, you'll see there's a live transcript button there. That is a closed captioning option, if you would like that. Great. We face in the United States major national security challenges, and whether it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, who were inaugurated in January, the country is really facing critical questions and threats and opportunities, and we're going to be talking about those today with Colin Call, who is a former colleague here at the University of Minnesota. We're very grateful he's taken time with us to chat about these issues. He's currently the Stephen C. Hazy Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. Mr. Call has served in a number of national security positions during the Obama administration, and during the Biden administration, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which is the key kind of policy brain in the Pentagon. He was principal advisor to the Secretary of State, big mistake, to principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense on matters related to national security and defense policy. Colin Call, thank you so much for joining us. You are muted, which is
I was cursing your name, Larry. No, Larry, I was saying, Larry, it's great to be back. I have a deep affection for the University of Minnesota. We still have a cabin in Minnesota we spend every summer. So anytime I can be back with Minnesotans, it's a good day. Great.
Well, that's kind of you to say that. Let's just jump right in, and you kind of look at the Biden administration. It's had its share of national security and foreign policy challenges. Just kind of looking back over some of the headlines, there was the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan about 8 or 9 months into the administration. Russia launched a full-on invasion of Ukraine with the objective of toppling the regime in February 2022. We've seen multiple crises in the Middle East and challenges there. The conflict and instability in the West Bank is raging. We have a full-on war going on in Gaza, and then with Syria and Lebanon, Iran is about to launch some sort of retaliation for Israel's assassination of a high-level Hamas officer. So there's a lot going on here. When you look back at where the administration has come from, how would you describe that set of events?
Yeah, I mean, the world's a hard place. And I think, especially for Americans who have come of age in the post-Cold War period, where the United States has kind of been at the peak of its power and influence in the world, there's sometimes a sense that we can snap our fingers and make the world exactly as we want it, and we can't. And I think that over the last several years, we've all been mugged by a number of geopolitical realities, and the reality is that while the United States remains the world's most powerful state, the relative disparity between the United States and our competitors is less than it was at the end of World War II, or the end of as it was during the end of the Cold War. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing in the world, in a sense, is a manifestation of that structural change. I also just think, look, coming out of 4 years of the Trump administration, there was a lot of turbulence. Let's all, on your litany of things that we had to deal with, of course, when we came into office, the world was still struggling with the COVID pandemic, which was, the greatest international shock since the Great Depression to the world community. So there's, the world is harder. And as someone who served until the very last day of the Obama administration at the White House, where I was then Vice President Biden's national security advisor, the world felt demonstrably harder just 4 years later, re-entering the U.S. government. I would just point to kind of three general layers of trends that we've had to contend with, and that this administration has to contend with, but the next administration, whether it's Harris or Trump, will have to contend with. I would think of them in terms of kind of three different layers. There's the geopolitical layer, the technopolitical layer, and the layer of externalities. The geopolitical layer is just that great power competition is back. The United States not only faces competition from China, which is the only country that has both the capability and intent to displace the United States as the world's leading actor, but obviously the threat that Russia poses, not just in Europe, but to American interests more broadly, the challenges we face in the Middle East from Iran, the challenges we face in Northeast Asia from North Korea, and the fact that some have started to describe this club as kind of an axis of upheaval, in the sense of kind of a group of rivals and adversaries of the United States that are counterbalancing against the United States, but also increasingly cooperating with one another. And that connectivity, while not new, has been strengthened, kind of dialed to 11 as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, which has weakened Russia and therefore made it considerably more reliant on China, North Korea, and Iran. So you kind of have that as one geopolitical fact. And then you have essentially a club of democracies that is attempting to preserve what remains of the liberal international order that was constructed after the Second World War. And obviously the United States is at the center of that, but alongside our NATO allies or other G7 allies. And so you are seeing this contest between essentially these two clubs or coalitions. And then, of course, you have a huge swath of humanity, call them the global South, call them the global majority, that don't want to pick sides. And so you are in a more of a kind of geopolitical free-for-all than at any time in my adult lifetime. You have that techno-political layer, which is obviously we're in the midst of a dramatic set of technological revolutions, artificial intelligence, clean energy, biotechnology, quantum science, and you can kind of go down the list. But you also have the fact that most of these technologies are being developed by the private sector, not by governments. And so you have companies that are $2-3 trillion companies. They have the resources of a G20 country, and they have, in some instances, near sovereign control over the domains through which we all live our lives, whether that's platforms online or cloud computing or proliferated low Earth orbit communications architectures. And so they are also actors in their own rights, not just domains. And then you have the externalities layer that as states and companies all bump into each other, they create good stuff, but also bad stuff. So obviously we lived through COVID, but climate change is the biggest externality we have to deal with. And that creates transnational problems, which can't be solved by any one nation or even a coalition of nations, but has to be broadly cooperative. And so that's just a harder world than the one even 4 or 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, that is a harder world. And yet Joe Biden was saying America's back when he came into power. And plenty of people look at the record and say there's just so many blemishes there, and that the world didn't really mold to our objectives. Is what you're saying basically America needs to lower its expectations, that the kind of assumptions about the primacy of U.S. power and our ability to shape circumstances and events to meet our objectives, that's over?
Well, look, I mean, to the degree that this really reached its zenith in the immediate lead up and aftermath of 9/11, where there was a lot of magical thinking about American primacy. You even had people talking openly about what they described as American empire, which used to not be a word that Americans who broke away from an empire ever embraced, or American hegemony or any of that. I think I think as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated, there was always magical thinking involved in that. I think when President Biden talks about America being back, he means that the United States has come back to our alliances and partnerships. And the reality is that all the challenges that I talked about in the world, whether it's the geopolitical challenges from the axis of upheaval, or these revolutionary technologies, or the externalities like climate change and pandemics, like foreign policy is a team sport. And while the relative disparity between the United States and our competitors has shrunk, when you add up the United States and our allies and partners, the disparity is as big as it's ever been. And so if we want to solve these challenges or manage and mitigate their risks, we have to work alongside others. And there is no question that the Biden administration has strengthened our alliances and partnerships, not just relative to where they were under Trump, where they were in very rough shape, but compared to any time since the post-Cold War period, whether you're talking about this, the solidarity and the strengthening and expansion of NATO in the aftermath of Ukraine, or whether you're talking about the historic events that have happened in the Indo-Pacific with the strengthening of the Quad and the AUKUS agreement and the trilateral arrangements between the United States, South Korea, and Japan, and the United States, Japan, and the Philippines, and the United States, Japan, and Australia, plus bilateral initiatives with India and Australia and Vietnam and the Philippines and Japan, and allies really stepping up alongside us. That's the part of Joe Biden's record which is unquestionably good news for U.S. security. And the harder the world gets, the more we need our team. And the thing that I worry about the most, frankly, about the process in a foreign policy sense, from the prospect of a Trump 2.0, is that Trump doesn't see our allies and partners as assets. He sees them as liabilities, and he treats them with the same transactional mentality that he treats anybody else. And I think we are just weaker and less capable of dealing with a turbulent world when we don't have our allies and partners standing next to us.
One of the one of the structuring realities in terms of the international order were the set of rules put in place following World War II. It may have roots before, but Bretton Woods and then a whole series of others. And you have things like World Trade Organization and others that become central to a 60-year or more period of stability. That we could kind of fumble around about what the right word is, but it appears to be over, or at least in severe decline. The World Trade Organization is stymied with deadlock. Ditto with the UN Security Council. You've got countries like Brazil and India, which are very important, basically taking a transactional approach of what's the best set of alliances on discrete set of issues. And if we are relying on this kind of, or hoping to maintain this rules-based order as a path to stability, which is where Jake Sullivan started at the beginning of the Biden administration, how do we handle this severe breakdown? What is the kind of 2.0 in terms of our modus vivendi in terms of international affairs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's not a single answer to it, in my view. But first, I would take half a step back and just say we do know what is not a solution. What is not a solution is to abandon these institutions, or believe that we don't need them at all, or that we don't need any institutions, or that we don't need multilateral cooperation. That's a pathway to ruin. The United States was more secure and more prosperous and more able to protect our values and our way of life because of the creation of those institutions and the norms and principles and rules that they embodied than at any time in our country's history. So what we can't do is turn away from it. But you're right, Larry. They're under strain, and it's not clear that the institutions which were established 75 plus years ago continue to be fit for purpose. And so, what do you do about that? Where you can, you should push to try to make these institutions more inclusive. So when we're talking about bodies like the United Nations or international financial institutions or other bodies, they should be more reflective of the changing demographic and economic and political power of the world. That isn't, it isn't exactly the way that it was at the end of the Second World War. You also need to look for new bodies that you can vest with responsibility. A constraint in all of these circumstances, of course, is that the geopolitical competition that I alluded to before includes competition by China and Russia, who are, veto holders on the UN Security Council. And so, again, a lot of us think of the role of the United Nations during kind of its hyper-activist phase after the end of the Cold War. But of course, for most of the Cold War, it was paralyzed by the Cold War. And so it's a little bit of a return to that. So I don't think we should even pretend that in the post-World War II era, these institutions worked seamlessly and flawlessly. So we have to reform these institutions where we can. I do think we have to look for ways in which we can find agreement in areas where all countries should share an interest, even countries that are rivals and adversaries. And so whether that's on, making sure that the climate crisis is addressed multilaterally and as inclusively as possible through the COP process and others, whether it's through, I think, very bold initiatives on the artificial intelligence safety and security standpoint with the AI safety summits and the various agreements and arrangements coming out of the OECD and the G20 and the G7 and the UN General Assembly. There may be some opportunities in domains like space that are fundamentally undergoverned. So we should push on that. And then lastly, and I think this is just respects the geopolitical reality that I've talked about, there are going to be some issues that you won't be able to handle wholly inclusively, but rather are going to have to handle in the context of competitive clubs. And I think, in part, Russia is dealing with its challenges by circling the wagons with its club, relying economically on China, relying on Iran and North Korea for military assistance, rewiring its economy to focus east because it's been shut off from the West. But the United States also has its club that needs to cooperate on technology initiatives, export controls, resilient supply chains, and a whole host of other things that impact our security and our environment. And the competition between these clubs need not lead to conflict. In some cases, it can lead to a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. I'm not afraid of competition with China on electric vehicles or renewable energy, as long as that competition is on a level playing field. Because it benefits the world if the United States and China are competing for the cheapest, most reliable, greenest technologies. So anyway, I think it'll have to be an all of the above approach, not a one size fits all. But what we can't do is pretend we can either go back to the way that it was or completely abandon this because, the world's different. So who cares about the old stuff?
That's helpful. Thank you. You've been very involved in Ukraine. At one point we were talking, I had a sense of you as kind of like the US point person finding resources to get to Ukraine as fast as possible. And you've been a strong advocate for making sure Ukraine had the weapons it needed. What does winning look like to you in terms of Ukraine?
Look, I think at the end of the day, the Ukrainians will define what winning looks like to them. What I will say is, as a U.S. objective, and I think the winning and losing is a frame that I'm not terribly comfortable with, because I can imagine a world in which Ukraine wins because they get all their territory back. I could also imagine a world in which Ukraine wins because it emerges from the war somewhat smaller but much stronger. And both of those are versions of winning, but when you talk about winning in terms of just one dimension or the other, I'm not sure it's helpful to me. What our objectives are is to make sure that Ukraine continues to exist as a free, democratic, sovereign country, so that Russia's aggression wasn't able to snuff out a vibrant democracy on its border. we've seen a version of that movie before in the 1930s. It led to World War II, and we don't want the 2030s to look like the 1930s. So we want to make sure that Ukraine can defend itself, that Ukraine is able, in the event that the war ends, to deter Russia from doing this again. So that's one objective. The other objective is to make sure that the costs imposed on Russia are such that not only Vladimir Putin for the rest of his life, but other would-be aggressors think twice about running this play again. And if you think about it, yes, as we speak, Russia lays claim to about 20% of Ukraine's territory. They've also suffered somewhere between 350 and 400,000 casualties, wounded and dead, which is astronomically higher than they suffered in 10 years in Afghanistan and both wars in Chechnya put together. Their military continues to tread water, but its best capabilities have been decimated by this conflict. While NATO has grown and gotten stronger and bigger, and now the amount of NATO territory on Russia's border has doubled, 90% of the Russian army is stuck in Ukraine. All right. They have been isolated economically and politically such that they've had to turn towards countries they never wanted to be junior partners with. And so it's hard to say, even if Putin gets, at the end of the day, 20% of Ukraine's territory, was that a win for Russia? Doesn't look like a win to me. We defeated Saddam Hussein in a couple of weeks in Iraq. It didn't feel like victory. So I think what's important is that Putin draws the lesson that it wasn't worth it, and that Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and the supreme leader in Iran draw similar conclusions that that this type of aggression will be resisted, and not just by the United States, but part of the effort that we led at the Pentagon, and really I give most of the credit to Secretary Austin, who was my boss, was marshaling 50 countries, 50 countries from all around the world to provide security assistance to Ukraine. We did our part when I was there for the first 2.5 years, or the first, I guess, year and a half of the conflict. We provided $43 billion in security assistance, but our allies and partners contributed almost as much. So I'm very proud of that. And I just think what we can't do is come in and basically say, this isn't our problem. Essentially what Donald Trump has said is he will hand this problem off to the Europeans, that he's done. America doesn't have a vested interest in this. We should be focused on our border, not focused on the border in Ukraine. And that he'll basically call up Zelensky and Putin in the first 24 hours of being president, and he'll cut a deal. And what that basically means is throwing Zelensky under the bus and agreeing to whatever Putin tells him.
Usually in national security, there's a confluence of the national security experts in both parties. And I've attended a few meetings, and it's just remarkable, the shared values, the understanding of reality. What's going on here? Why is it that we see in Congress such a large number of Republicans who are opposed to the very policy that you've described, and see it as a negative for the United States?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I had lots of disagreements with the George W. Bush administration, for example, but some of my dearest friends in the foreign policy space in Washington served in the second term of the George W. Bush administration, which was not all that different, frankly, from the Obama administration's policies on a lot of things. Very reasonable, very internationalist, very pragmatic. So not the first term, which obviously saw the immediate reaction to 9/11, but the second term. And yeah, I think, to use a football field analogy, there are disagreements, but they're kind of disagreements between the 40-yard lines, right? They're not debating over the whole field. None of those people can get jobs. They couldn't get jobs in the first Trump administration. They certainly won't get jobs in the second Trump administration. They are kind of people without a party. I think that the reason why you've seen a turn is that essentially there are a set of folks, Trump included, but those around him, who basically believe that all of the problems that the United States has had on the world stage stem from there kind of being this establishment view that is overly militaristic or overly imperialistic or too much focused on projecting American values abroad and want to come home and are more unilateralist, more isolationist, see our allies as liabilities, not as assets. Certainly, Trump views them that way. And so there isn't space for this previous cadre. In terms of Congress, I think it's a combination of two things. First, there's been a lot of turnover. There are a lot of people who've basically entered Congress as Trumpian Republicans. And if they haven't, they've adapted themselves to that rhetoric. Think of a person like Marco Rubio and how far he's moved on some of these issues. Or there are people who secretly still believe what they used to believe, but are afraid to say it because they believe they'll get tarred and feathered by the MAGA crowd. And that's unfortunate. I still do think there's a consensus in Washington, including in Congress, for U.S. engagement with the world and a degree of internationalism. We should all give up on the magical thinking of the immediate post-Cold War and immediate 9/11 era. But that doesn't mean we should pull all the way back because, Trump likes to talk about America first. America first, of course, was also a slogan in the interwar years, especially in the late 1930s in the United States with the America First movement, which argued for keeping the United States out of World War II because the problems over there were not our business and we could pull back and we could have a strong military and pull back to the Western Hemisphere and we'd be fine and wall ourselves off from the rest of the world. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, the world's gotten too small for that to happen. The events overseas do reverberate into the United States. And he was, of course, proved right when Pearl Harbor happened. But just think about how much more interdependent we are with the rest of the world economically, in terms of security, in terms of the environment, in terms of information. So the notion that we can come home and not be active in the world and protect our security and our prosperity and our way of life is a fantasy.
Yeah, I've talked to plenty of Republicans. They don't see it as a fantasy. They're very, very critical, dismissive of what had been a bipartisan understanding of the U.S. role in the world. I want to shift gears, talk about Israel. You were just talking about this element in Congress that wants to pull back. Israel, of course, was savagely attacked on October 7th. 1,200 innocent Israelis were slaughtered. And I think there's a wide agreement that Israel needs to protect itself. Now we're, some number of months into Israel's war in Gaza. There doesn't appear to be a game plan here. Some people think Netanyahu, the prime minister in Israel, is cynically stretching it out to avoid possible prison. But there are over 40,000 Palestinians who have been killed, according to the authorities in Gaza. And there is a serious split in the Democratic Party over this. So you kind of combine the kind of isolationist inclinations of some Republicans with the vitriol among some Democrats to pull back from providing unlimited weapons to Gaza. Where does that leave the U.S. relationship with Israel moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no harder issue that the Biden administration has to deal with than this. I mean, let me start where you started, which is, the events of October 7th, 1,200 Israelis on a single day, butchered, raped, more than 200 taken hostage, an assault on civilians. There is no moral, ethical, religious, or justice-oriented framework that justifies an attack like that. And on a per capita basis, had that happened in the United States, that would have been 40,000 Americans in a single day. Can you imagine? So obviously, Israel not only had the right, but the responsibility to defend itself in the face of an attack like that. That doesn't absolve them from the obligation, legal, ethical, and moral, to conduct their military operation in a way that seeks to minimize the harm to non-combatants, to civilians. And I think that a lot of the criticism stems from the fact that there is a sense that while I do not believe that the IDF targets Palestinian civilians, I do not believe that. I do think that there are certainly numerous instances in which Israeli understandings of the norms and rules of proportionality were such that in striking Hamas targets, they killed way too many Palestinian civilians. And I worked a lot around the U.S. military in Iraq and during the counter-ISIS campaign. I know how hard this is. I know when, insurgents and terrorist organizations operate from within civilian areas, when they use civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, clinics, when they build tunnels underneath apartment buildings. They do this not only to create human shields around them, but because they want civilian casualties. Because it helps them politically, which puts militaries in an agonizing position of either not prosecuting their military objectives or doing so and risking civilian casualties. So I don't want to minimize how hard this has been for the Israelis, but I do think they have not taken enough care in quite a few instances to minimize the risk to Palestinians. And the humanitarian consequences in Gaza are horrific. In terms of the displacement, in terms of the destruction, in terms of the food insecurity. There are a whole host of other problems around humanitarian aid and access and those issues. So I think, what the Biden administration has tried to do is signal support for Israel's security while being increasingly critical of some of the things that Israel has done. And also pressing them to be better on the humanitarian side, but also to agree to a ceasefire. And I think you've seen that ramped up over the last couple of months with, what happened at the United Nations, a bunch of statements that Biden has made, very strong joint statement just in the last few days, pressing the parties that it's now or never on the ceasefire. There's supposed to be a meeting on Thursday to try to seal the deal. We'll see if it happens. I think the challenge has been that the United States does not have infinite influence and control over this. The United States could end its arms sales to Israel tomorrow, and it wouldn't stop Israel's war. And so what's your theory of influence? Not you personally, Larry, but what's one's theory of influence? And I think President Biden has been of the view that making it clear that we support Israel's security on net provides us more influence than if we cut them off. Not to mention all the politics surrounding it, and we can talk about that. The challenge, of course, is that Netanyahu has very maximalist goals as it relates to Hamas. They're so maximalist that pretty much nobody else in his government agrees with him. You saw him just in the last 24 hours take a shot at Minister of Defense Gallant, who's no softy, because Gallant said in private that you can't destroy Hamas completely, which is just stating the obvious. And it earned him a public admonishment by the prime minister. You have all these leaks from Mossad and Shin Bet, who are kind of in the lead for negotiations over the ceasefire, suggesting that Netanyahu has been moving the goalposts on the ceasefire initiative in a way that's not productive. Those aren't American criticisms. Those are Israeli criticisms. So I think there is a distinction. I don't know how much of it is personalistic. I think it's largely because this is the most right-leaning government in Israel's history. And the far right flank of Netanyahu's government, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, some real extreme guys, have essentially threatened to topple the government in the event that Bibi Netanyahu signs up to anything. So I do think one gets the sense that he's been torn between the pressure from the international community and from the United States and his coalition dynamics. But I think if this is going to change, it's going to come more from the internal pressure among Israelis, who clearly, the majority of Israelis, want a hostage deal. They want a ceasefire. And so I think what the Biden administration is pushing for is in the mainstream in Israeli public opinion, and now it's up to the Israeli government to accept, and then of course for the international community to put pressure on Hamas to also be willing to accept that agreement.
I think that's all reasonable, and I thank you for adding the complexity to what is sometimes an oversimplified issue. But I think there's also a very clear new politics of the U.S.-Israeli relations moving forward. There will never be a Joe Biden friend to Israel from the Democratic Party. It's just not going to happen. There's going to be a big battle, and we're seeing it play out with AIPAC's support for toppling some of the most progressive members of Congress. But that is just the kind of an extreme. The mainstream of the Democratic Party is now moving away from kind of this big hug approach to Netanyahu and a kind of open arms supply. Maybe some arms, but not 2,000-pound bombs that are blowing up neighborhoods. So I think that is the new reality that we're going to move into, and Israel's going to have to make its own decisions, though they will have a vote. I've been to Israel last year, and as part of the academic exchange out of Stanford, actually, and it was just very clear that there is a pretty strong support for the general orientation of a kind of a militaristic approach to the Palestinians. The left has disappeared, and so that's the clash. The clash is between Israel that believes and is under assault, and in America that you've got the isolationists and you've got this backlash in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that I think Washington and Jerusalem have not caught up to the changes in the two societies. Let's just put it that way. I think that there is an assumption among some that you can kind of just steady as she goes on the U.S.-Israel relationship. I think that is becoming more fraught in the United States for a host of demographic reasons, essentially generational, ideological, and yes, a lot of that centers in the Democratic Party, but not exclusively. And I also think in Israel, you have had a general tendency, to move right and to be quite cynical on the Palestinian issue and understandably hostile in the aftermath of October 7th. But let's not forget, on October 6th, and for just about every day before that, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis out in the street protesting Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition attempting to move Israel in the direction of an illiberal democracy, a kind of like Hungary, Turkey type of situation. So, Israeli opinion is not monolithic either. And I think what you increasingly see in Israel is a real displeasure with their national leadership and a real divide between, maybe the old left in Israel is not what it used to be, but are huge segments of the Israeli population that are very concerned about the right-leaning tendencies to chip away at Israeli democracy. So my hope is that coming out of this, we can start to have a more adult conversation about the U.S.-Israel relationship, but also that, frankly, the center will reestablish itself in Israeli politics, which will allow that more adult conversation to be a two-way dialogue and not a monologue.
If there is a Harris-Waltz administration, do you think that an adult shift would occur?
So I don't speak for the Harris campaign. I think that they will be surrounded by a lot of smart folks and have good instincts. I think the challenge will not be on the U.S. side. I think the challenge will be, as long as this government is in it, they're a democracy. They have the right to have whatever government they elect. So it's not my job to tell them what kind of government they should have. But I'll say, the longer you have a government that is this right-leaning and is this beholden to a very small number of right-wing extremists, it just makes it harder to have that type of conversation.
Talked about China. There's a bipartisan agreement, not agreement, not consensus for sure. And there's wide agreement among national security folks that China is, as Jake Sullivan and you have described it, is the pacing challenge for the United States. And one of the questions that's been raised is, are we overreacting to China? Are we kind of elevating China into this kind of super threat? Now, we can both go through a number of reasons why there ought to be concern about China. Its efforts certainly to threaten Taiwan, its threats to the rules-based international order, its efforts in the Middle East to displace the U.S., as we've seen with their their efforts to build relations with Saudi Arabia, their efforts to establish the renminbi which is their currency, as the global currency, which would have catastrophic implications for the US. You just go down the list. There's a lot about China that is of concern. The question is, are we approaching it the right way by kind of elevating China into this, existential threat?
Look, I think it depends on whose view of China one is talking about. I do think that there's a lot of bipartisan consensus that China represents the most consequential strategic competitor to the United States. But how that slices, I think there is still a lot of variability. There are folks even within, kind of Trump's advisors who lean towards focusing on the kind of trade practices and technology issues, but don't actually care all that much about China's actions in the region because they're not big on America's allies and partners in the region. And there are others who very much care about China's actions in the Indo-Pacific. I think in the Democratic Party you have differences too. I think one thing we need to be mindful of is that we don't fall into a self-fulfilling prophecy where we spiral into a devastating conflict. And President Biden's been very clear about this. We don't want a Cold War. We certainly don't want a conflict. And the reason for that is it would be disastrous. It would be disastrous for the United States. It'd be disastrous for China. It'd be disastrous for the world. It's in nobody's interest. But to say that is not to say that, therefore, we need to accommodate China in every way and avoid competition with them, because the reality is China is engaged in a whole host of things that challenge U.S. national interests. They have territorial ambitions across the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, on the disputed border with India. They could cause big wars in Asia. They could implicate U.S. allies and partners and draw the United States in. We have an interest in seeing that not happen and deterring that from happening. China also has global ambitions to displace the United States as the world's most influential actor. That not only has implications for our security and prosperity, but let's keep in mind, yes, China is a communist country. They don't want to take over the world ideologically in the way that the Soviet Union did. But Xi Jinping very much, even if he doesn't want to export their ideology, does want to export their methodology. That is their form of digital authoritarianism. And a China that dominates the world's infrastructure, the world's data, the commanding heights of the technologies through which we will live the rest of our lives, and the norms, rules, standards, and institutions around all of that scaffolding will be a world that, in Xi Jinping's mind, is safe for the CCP, right? It's a world in which China can be integrated and great without having to worry about its autocracy being undermined at home. It's also a world that would be, very much at odds with the American way of life. And so we have an interest in competing with China and deterring China. And the real question is, can you compete and deter without sliding into the type of conflict that's disastrous? And I believe that is what Joe Biden has very successfully navigated, strengthening our alliances, getting tough on China in terms of technology, while also putting guardrails around the relationship to kind of put a floor under it so that it doesn't spiral into conflict. And I'll leave it to others to think about how Donald Trump would handle that relationship moving forward. I think, frankly, it's hard to say because a lot of it will be his personal relationship with Xi Jinping. But I think that President Biden deserves a lot of credit for navigating the relationship so that we take the challenge from China seriously without sliding into the type of conflict that your question was premised around.
Do you think there's a higher chance today than in the past that we could see China invade Taiwan?
I think that the prospect of China invading Taiwan is conceivable, but it is neither imminent nor inevitable. And I think it is less likely today than it was when Joe Biden took office. And I think that's for a whole host of reasons, the investments we've made on the defense side, the investments we've made to help Taiwan. But I think a lot of it is what we've done to stitch together our alliance network and partnership network in the Indo-Pacific and actually increasingly get allies and partners around the world to convey some skin in the game as it relates to Taiwan, but also because of Ukraine. And while there are some, especially in the Republican Party, that like to frame a trade-off between what we're doing in Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific, that's not what I saw when I was at the Pentagon. Because every single day, Xi Jinping asks himself the question, if I make this decision to go after Taiwan, will it be like Hong Kong, where they kind of snuffed out a vibrant democracy and folded them into the mainland and the world just kind of yawned and went on? Or will it look like Ukraine? Long, hard, slog, costly, not just militarily, but economically, diplomatically. And if he thinks it'll be a lot more like Ukraine, he won't do it. I'm convinced he won't do it because the one thing he can't do is launch the invasion and fail. Because that would be an existential risk to his presidency and to the party. So I think we are in a much better position now than we were a handful of years ago. And I think we can keep that trend in that direction. And that, given China's economic headwinds at home, they're not looking so hot right now either. I think we can, if we keep at it with urgency, deter them from doing it. So I do think the risk is real. We should take it seriously. We have to take it with urgency. I don't think it's imminent or inevitable. And I think we're in slightly better shape than we were just a few years ago.
You've been working on the issue around technology and cybersecurity and the U.S. military. And if you kind of look back in history, one of the impressive aspects of the U.S. military in terms of our weapon systems, in terms of our leadership, in terms of our troops, is these qualitative shifts. As the economy and American society has changed, there's been 2 or 3 major shifts. And so the question right now is, why isn't the U.S. more quickly and more agile manner engaging in this shift to incorporate the technology and the cybersecurity issues, AI and on into our military?
Yeah, it's an important question. I would start by saying, the good news is, in terms of the leading technologies around the world, the United States is in a quite envious position right now. The United States is probably 2 to 3 years ahead of China on artificial intelligence. We're probably 5 to 10 years ahead of them on chips, on the semiconductors that enable AI and other digital applications, and the policies the Biden administration has put in place, both to promote that and protect that, have helped cement that lead. But we're also world leaders in biotechnology. Our space companies are the most innovative in the world. And, because of the investments from the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure bill and others, the United States is really in the game on clean energy technologies too. So I think we're in a good position. I think a challenge, of course, is that historically, a lot of technologies with national security implications were developed by the Department of Defense or by U.S. National labs. Now they're developed by Meta and OpenAI and Microsoft and Google and, you name it. So, or when you're talking about space, by SpaceX, right? So figuring out how to engage the commercial sector. And I think a couple of things. One, there's widespread recognition that the United States government needs to lean more into the commercial sector to leverage their technologies. There's a widespread appreciation of that. There's also an understanding in Congress that's given the Pentagon more authorities to do this. They just gave the Defense Innovation Unit in Silicon Valley $1 billion last year and a bunch of authorities to accelerate a bunch of this stuff. Every armed service has an acceleration lab and a portion of them that are trying to rapidly adopt commercial technologies. And the United States is partnering with these companies increasingly to either bring the technologies in or to leverage them. So, for example, one of the major plays that Space Force is making to make their constellations in orbit more resilient is to lean on the commercial sector, to include SpaceX. So I think a lot is being done. The challenge, of course, is that this is all, things move really fast, and U.S. bureaucracy never moves fast, and it requires different types of money, different types of authorities, and a different mentality. And And oh, by the way, as we fold these technologies into our national security enterprise, we also have to do them in a way that's safe and secure. And that's especially true when you're talking about technologies like artificial intelligence. And I'm very proud that my office oversaw the redrafting of the Department of Defense directive on AI and autonomous weapons, so that we make sure that to the degree that artificial intelligence is integrated into weapons platforms, it's done responsibly, because I think the American public wouldn't want us to do it any other way. We also championed the global declaration on the responsible integration of AI, which now more than 50 countries have signed up to. So, I think we're moving in the right direction. You want to move fast enough to stay ahead of our competitors, but not so fast that you generate a whole bunch of security and safety risks. And so we have to balance that too.
Okay. I just want to give a shout out to folks if you're interested in this topic. Colin Call had a piece in Brookings this spring that goes through some of these measures to try to keep the technology and cybersecurity and AI within bounds, actually to adapt it to pre-existing conventions with regards to nuclear weapons. And so that's important and quite interesting. Let me ask you another question on this. So we're running out of time and I want to get to a few other questions, but obviously the shift is requiring the involvement of Congress, authorization and appropriations. Do you think Congress has the knowledge and the curiosity to be able to understand what is being proposed and the urgency?
I mean, look, I think across the US government, we could all benefit from bringing in more expertise on cutting edge issues, especially those that touch on the bleeding edge of science and technology. And that's not a Congress thing. That's true of the executive branch too. So, I don't want to cast aspersions at Congress. That they have a lot of extraordinarily smart folks. A lot of members have national security experience or have thought very deeply about this. Their staffs have as well, and that's true of members in both parties. I think the bigger problem is not expertise. I think it's just that our Congress doesn't function on anything. Like they don't pass budgets on time. They can't agree on things that we used to be able to agree on. And I think, frankly, when I worry about all of the national security challenges that the United States faces, the one we have to worry about first and foremost is like whether our democracy survives and whether that democracy can govern. And I think the degree of partisanship and polarization, the fact that so many chase the viral moment instead of the policy that'll actually make us all safer and more prosperous, the fact that it's very difficult for people to take political risk to partner with the other side, and when they do, they get shut down. Just think about the bipartisan border bill and all the drama around that. And so I think it's less of an expertise issue and more just of a general problem. And certainly when I was at the DoD, we can debate about whether, when Joe Biden proposes an 830 or 840 billion defense budget, it should be higher or lower. Like, that's reasonable. But you know what's not reasonable? Not passing a budget for 6 months. That's not reasonable. So, mostly I would just like Congress to do its job.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions as we're running out of time here. You've been talking about differences with the Trump perspective, MAGA perspective, some of the Republicans. And one of the questions we have here is.
Oh, now you put yourself on mute there, Larry.
I'll just jump. What is the impact on the U.S. international standing when we have this kind of switching back and forth between, let's say, Democratic perspective and the Trump perspective?
Look, this is a huge challenge for the United States, and it's not about Trump. It's more just the general perception that, every 4 to 8 years, the United States is going to reset its foreign policy principles at the most foundational level. And that was just something that people didn't have to worry about quite so much. And I think previously, and I think they also worry that by tradition, it used to be if you signed an agreement, could be a treaty, but not oftentimes it wasn't a treaty. It was an executive agreement with one administration. Even if the next administration didn't like it, they didn't immediately come in and tear it up. And, let's recall when Trump came into office in January of 2017, what did he do? He immediately pulled us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the most ambitious trade agreement negotiated in a generation. He immediately, reversed course on normalization of relations with Cuba. He withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Accord, and he wanted to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal initially, but was kind of talked out of it for a year by folks like Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson and H.R. McMaster, who aren't softies on Iran or the world, but understood that kind of throwing away the nuclear deal was a bad idea, but then walked away from that too. So I think the challenge, and then of course all the threatening to pull troops out of Korea if they didn't pony up on trade issues, doing the same with Germany, cozying up to dictators, whether it was Kim Jong-un or Putin or whatever. I think basically if you are an ally or part of the United States, you're like, can we count on you?
Right, exactly.
It's a fundamental question, and it's a hard one to answer. I think we have to get through this moment. I think there's still a bipartisan consensus if we can get past this moment on a responsible, pragmatic, internationalist U.S. foreign policy that is more restrained than it was after the end of the Cold War, after 9/11, to be sure, but not isolationist, and understands the values of coalitions and alliances and partnerships. I think there is a consensus for that internationalist view to include among the American people. But we have to get through this moment. And if we can move back to some version of that consensus where we are debating between the 40-yard lines, or at least between the 30-yard lines, but not over the whole field, then I think some of these credibility questions can be addressed. But it's a challenge. And the implication is that countries hedge. And they hedge by either not being willing to sign agreements with you because they're worried you won't comply with them, or they hedge by playing both sides, having relations with us, but also having relations with our competitors and adversaries in ways that don't serve our interests or aren't compatible with our values.
Yeah, I've actually been spending time with some Republicans who are, advising Trump, and their view is that it's the Democrats who keep bringing us back to a failed international, multinational orientation. And I think your point is premised on the idea that Donald Trump doesn't win in November. It's a moment, it passes with Trump's passing from the political scene. I don't know. I'm uncertain about whether how this is going to work out.
It's just I'm just not convinced that a return to Jacksonianism, which was arguably not appropriate in the middle of the 19th century, is what we need in the middle of the 21st century. But maybe call me crazy.
No one's calling you crazy. Colin Call, thank you so much. It's been a terrific conversation, enlightening, and I think the folks who joined us today learned a lot. It was generous of you to spend so much time with us. Just want to give a quick shout out to a couple of our programs coming up. We often see in the media a lot about the right wing pressure on the Republican Party and moving it to the right. There's also quite a vibrant debate among progressives and the left trying to move the Democratic Party. We have John Judas coming in August 20th. That's in a week. Same time, same place. September 12th, Rick Hassan, who's an election law expert at UCLA, will join us to talk about the threats to the 2024 election. If you don't know Professor Hassan, I encourage you to join us. Very, very smart guy. September 18th, we are continuing our Conservative Voices series, and we'll have in Robert Doar, who's the president of the American Enterprise Institute, a well-known conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. And finally, I want to let you know that this event was recorded. It'll be posted in a day or two on all your favorite podcast sources. Just search Dialogue Across Difference and you'll find it. If you enjoyed the program, feel free to make a contribution. We'd appreciate that. Colin Call, again, thank you so much. This was really fantastic. I have a feeling we could have gone on a little longer.
Yeah, mostly because I'm long-winded. Larry, it's always great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me. And as I said, it's always great to be back with the Minnesota crowd.